The handcuffs were still clicking shut when Mary Catherine Edwards drew her last breath in a Beaumont, Texas bathtub on the 14th of January 1995. Her parents found her bound with police-grade restraints, bruised and lifeless in water that had long grown cold. The elementary school teacher who touched hundreds of young lives was gone, murdered by someone who knew exactly how to silence her forever. For 29 years, this small Texas town carried a terrible secret. Neighbors whispered about the killer who walked among them. Students left flowers at her classroom door. Her twin sister Allison refused to let Mary's memory fade, even when leads went cold and hope seemed lost. But when DNA finally spoke the truth in 2021, it revealed a betrayal so shocking that it shattered everything Beaumont believed about trust, friendship, and the people they thought they knew. Who kills the person who once stood beside them at their own wedding? Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The grocery bag crinkled against the January morning, cold as Mr. and Mrs. Edwards walked up the concrete path to their daughter's townhouse. Inside the paper sack, a homemade apple pie sat carefully wrapped, still warm from the oven that morning. Mrs. Edwards had woken early to bake it, knowing how Mary loved her mother's cooking after a long week teaching second grade. "She's probably still in bed, Mr. Edwards said, glancing at his watch. It was barely past 9 on this Saturday morning, and Mary had mentioned staying up late grading papers the night before. They knocked on the door. No answer. Mrs. Edwards pressed her ear against the cold wood, listening for movement inside. "Nothing. Mary, honey?" she called, knocking again. "We brought you some groceries." When silence stretched beyond comfort, Mr. Edwards pulled out the spare key Mary had given them years ago. "She might be in the shower," he said, though. Something in his voice suggested he didn't quite believe it himself. The door swung open to reveal Mary's neat living room, nothing out of place. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter, car keys beside it. The house felt too quiet, too still. "Mary," Mrs. Edwards called again, walking toward the back of the house. The scream that came from the bathroom would echo through the neighborhood for years to come. It was a sound that spoke of discovery too terrible for words, of a mother finding her child in a condition no parent should ever witness. Mr. Edwards rushed toward the sound, dropping the grocery bag. The apple pie rolled across the kitchen floor as neighbors began emerging from their own homes, drawn by a cry that seemed to pierce the very fabric of their quiet Saturday morning. Detective Wallace arrived at the scene within minutes of the 911 call, his practiced eyes immediately taking in details that would matter later. The bathroom door stood open, revealing Mary Catherine Edwards in the bathtub, her wrists bound with what appeared to be standard police-issue handcuffs. The water had been drained by the first responders, but the scene remained largely undisturbed. Wallace pulled on latex gloves and began his methodical examination, photographing everything from multiple angles. The bruising on Mary's wrists and ankles told a story of struggle, of someone fighting against restraints. No sign of forced entry, Officer Martinez reported from the front of the house. Door was locked when the parents arrived. They used their spare key. Wallace nodded, making notes. The handcuffs drew his attention repeatedly. They were genuine law enforcement restraints, not the novelty type found in adult stores. Someone with access to police equipment had been here, someone who knew how to use them. "We'll need DNA from everything," he told the crime scene technician. "The handcuffs, the faucet handles, anywhere he might have touched." The technician swabbed carefully, sealing each sample in its own evidence bag. In 1995, DNA technology was still relatively new, but it had already solved cases that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Martinez asked quietly. Wallace looked around the small bathroom one more time, his gaze settling on the handcuffs. Someone she knew, someone she trusted enough to let into her house. Outside, Mary's parents sat in the back of an ambulance, Mrs. Edwards still clutching the dish towel she'd grabbed to cover her daughter's body. The apple pie lay forgotten on the kitchen floor, its presence a reminder of how quickly normal could become nightmare. By Monday morning, flowers began appearing outside Mary Catherine Edwards' second-grade classroom at Beaumont Elementary. Small hands had drawn pictures in crayon stick figures with yellow hair like Miss Edwards, rainbows, and hearts with "We love you" written in careful 7-year-old script. Principal Johnson found herself fighting tears as she watched children approach the makeshift memorial with their offerings. They didn't understand death, not really. They only knew their favorite teacher hadn't come to school, and their little hearts were breaking. "When is Miss Edwards coming back?" asked Tommy Martinez, tugging on the principal's skirt with small fingers. His drawing showed him and Mary standing beside the reading corner where she'd helped him sound out difficult words. "Miss Edwards had to go away," Johnson said gently, kneeling to Tommy's level. "But she loved you very much, and she would want you to keep reading your books." That evening, as twilight painted the Texas sky purple and gold, more than 200 people gathered in Beaumont's town square. Allison Edwards stood at the makeshift podium, her voice steady despite the tears flowing down her cheeks. "My sister Mary touched every life she met, Allison began, looking out at the sea of faces. Teachers from the school, neighbors, parents, or of Mary's students, people who'd known her since childhood. She believed every child could learn if someone just cared enough to help them. Candles flickered in the evening breeze as the crowd listened. This was still the time for grief, for remembering the woman who had been taken from them. Later would come the questions, the suspicions, the slow fracturing of trust that would define Beaumont for decades to come. "We will not let her be forgotten," Allison promised, her voice carrying across the square. "We will not let whoever did this win." The police station's conference room filled with media and concerned citizens as Chief Morrison approached the podium. Flash bulbs popped as he cleared his throat, the official transcript of his words destined to be read and reread for nearly 3 decades. "We are treating the death of Mary Catherine Edwards as a homicide," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of promise. "We will use every resource available to find her killer and bring him to justice." Detective Wallace sat in the back of the room, watching faces in the crowd. Somewhere among these concerned citizens, he believed, sat Mary's killer. The handcuffs suggested someone with law enforcement connections, someone who might even be in this very room. "We're asking anyone with information about Mary's activities in the days before her death to come forward," Morrison continued. "No detail is too small." The DNA samples had been sent to the state lab, where technicians would compare them against the combined DNA index system CODIS, a database of known offenders. In 1995, this technology represented the cutting edge of criminal investigation, and hopes ran high for a quick resolution. Over the following days, interviews began in earnest. Colleagues from the elementary school, neighbors, the handful of men Mary had dated over the years. Each conversation revealed the same picture: a kind, dedicated teacher with no known enemies, no dangerous relationships, no reason anyone would want to hurt her. "We'll find him," Officer Martinez assured the Edwards family as they sat in their living room late one night. The house felt too quiet without Mary's occasional visits, her laughter absent from the kitchen where she'd helped her mother bake countless pies over the years. "Mrs. Edwards looked up from her teacup, her eyes red from crying. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise me you won't give up." "We promise," Martinez said, though he couldn't know then how long that promise would take to keep. 3 weeks after Mary's death, the first cracks in the investigation began to show. The DNA from the crime scene had been processed, compared against every sample in the CODIS database, and yielded nothing. No match, no suspect, no leads that went anywhere meaningful. Detective Wallace found himself returning again and again to those handcuffs. They were Smith & Wesson Model 100 restraints, standard issue for law enforcement across Texas, but that meant hundreds of police officers, security guards, and correctional workers had access to identical equipment. Allison Edwards had grown impatient with the pace of the investigation. Her letters to the Beaumont Enterprise began appearing weekly, each one more pointed than the last. "It has been 23 days since my sister was murdered," she wrote in one published letter. "The police promised answers. We're still waiting." The letters struck a chord with readers. People began stopping the Edwards family at the grocery store, at church, offering condolences and asking if there were any developments. The case had become personal for the entire town. Mary's mother had begun keeping a scrapbook, cutting out every article about the investigation and filing them chronologically. She read each piece multiple times, searching for details the police might have missed, clues that could lead to her daughter's killer. Late one evening, Detective Wallace closed the case file and placed it in his desk drawer. Not permanently, he wasn't giving up, but the active investigation had stalled. Without new evidence or witnesses, there was little more he could do. "Not yet, Mary," he whispered to himself, a habit he'd developed when closing unsolved cases. But someday. Outside his office window, Beaumont settled into another quiet night, unaware that Mary's killer walked among them, perhaps sleeping peacefully while a family grieved and a detective wrestled with failure. Sunday morning at Beaumont Baptist Church had always been a time of community and comfort, but in the weeks following Mary's death, the atmosphere felt different. Whispered conversations stopped when the Edwards family entered. Sympathetic glances followed them to their usual pew, 3 rows from the front. The gossip had started innocently enough. People needed to make sense of what happened, to find explanations that would allow them to sleep safely in their beds. But as weeks passed without arrests, the speculation grew darker. "I heard it might have been a police officer," Mrs. Henderson whispered to her neighbor during coffee hour. "Those handcuffs weren't something just anyone could get." "Could have been someone she was seeing," replied Mrs. Chen. "You know how quiet she was about her personal life." The rumors spread through coffee shops and grocery store checkout lines, at PTA meetings and backyard barbecues. For the first time in decades, people in Beaumont began locking their doors at night. Hardware stores reported a run on deadbolts and security chains. Trust, once freely given in this small Texas town, became a precious commodity. Neighbors eyed each other with new suspicion. Was it the quiet man who worked security at the mall? The deputy sheriff who'd been acting strangely lately? The teacher from Mary's school who'd seemed too interested in the details of her death? The Edwards family felt the weight of these whispers. At church, conversations stopped when they approached groups. Well-meaning friends struggled for words, offering casseroles and awkward condolences while their eyes held questions no one dared ask aloud. It's like the whole town is holding its breath, Allison told her parents one evening. Everyone's waiting for the other shoe to drop. Mrs. Edwards nodded, understanding the sentiment. Somewhere in Beaumont lived a killer, and until he was caught, no one could truly rest. By December of 1995, the harsh reality set in. Mary Catherine Edwards's case had gone cold. The active investigation had been suspended pending new evidence or witnesses. The DNA sample sat in storage, waiting for a match that might never come. Mrs. Edwards had filled 3 scrapbooks by then, each page carefully documenting every article, every mention of her daughter's case in the local and regional press. She read them like scripture, searching for details that might spark new leads. "Look at this," she said to her husband one evening, pointing to a photograph in the newspaper. "They caught that man in Houston using DNA, same kind of evidence they have for Mary." Mr. Edwards looked at the article about a rape case solved after 2 years. "Maybe Mary's time will come too," he said quietly. The scrapbooks became Mrs. Edwards's obsession and her hope. She believed that keeping Mary's memory alive in the public eye would eventually lead to justice. Every anniversary, every mention in the paper, every letter Allison wrote to the editor was carefully preserved. Allison had grown more determined with each passing month. She'd begun attending victims' rights meetings in nearby counties, learning about cold case investigations and DNA technology. She wrote letters to the governor, to state legislators, to anyone who might listen. On a cold December evening, she closed the latest scrapbook and looked at her mother. "We'll never stop," she said. "Even if it takes 20 years, we'll never stop looking for answers." Mrs. Edwards reached over and patted her daughter's hand. Outside, Beaumont prepared for Christmas, families gathering in warm houses behind newly installed deadbolts. But in the Edwards home, time had stopped on the 14th of January, 1995, and would remain frozen there until justice came calling. The 14th of January, 1996. 1 year after Mary Catherine Edwards was found murdered in her bathtub, Beaumont Elementary School held a memorial service in her honor. The reading corner that had been dedicated to her memory overflowed with flowers, many brought by children who were now third graders. Tommy Martinez, taller now and reading at grade level, placed a drawing beside the memorial plaque. It showed Miss Edwards surrounded by smiling children, all holding books. At the bottom, in careful 8-year-old handwriting, he'd written, "Thank you for teaching me to love reading." Principal Johnson addressed the gathering of teachers, parents, and former students. Mary Edwards believed that education could change the world, one child at a time, she said. "Every book we help a child discover, every word we teach them to read, honors her memory." The service was small, intimate, attended mostly by people who had known Mary personally. The media attention had faded, replaced by newer tragedies and more recent mysteries. But for those who gathered in the school library that afternoon, Mary's presence felt as real as if she'd just stepped out of the room. Later that day, as the sun set over the cemetery, Allison knelt beside her sister's grave. The headstone, made of pink granite Mary would have loved, bore a simple inscription, "Beloved daughter, sister, and teacher. Her light continues to shine. We kept fighting this year," Allison whispered to the stone. "Mama kept her scrapbooks, I kept writing letters. The police haven't given up, even though it looks like they have." A cold wind moved through the cemetery, rustling the silk flowers someone had left earlier. Allison stood, pulling her coat tighter against the Texas winter. "We'll keep fighting, Mary. However long it takes." The late 1990 seconds blurred into the early 2000 seconds like pages turning in Mrs. Edwards's scrapbooks. New teachers filled Mary's classroom, their own decorations replacing the reading corner memorial that had gradually been moved to the school's main hallway. Allison built her career in social work, drawn to helping families navigate tragedy as she had learned to do. She never married, though friends suspected it was because she couldn't imagine celebrating a wedding when her twin would never have one. The Edwards parents aged visibly during these years. Mr. Edwards developed heart problems, spending long afternoons in his recliner, still reading every newspaper article his wife clipped. Mrs. Edwards attended every victim's rights meeting in 3 counties, becoming an advocate for other families whose cases had gone cold. "Time doesn't heal everything," she would tell other mothers who had lost children, "but it teaches you how to carry the weight." The scrapbooks multiplied. 4, then 5, then 6 thick volumes documenting not just Mary's case, but similar crimes across Texas and beyond. Mrs. Edwards read about DNA advances, new cold case units, genetic databases that grew larger each year. They solved the Johnson case in Austin, she told Allison during one of their weekly phone calls. 23 years after the murder, DNA from a cigarette butt. These small victories in other cases kept hope alive. Somewhere in a file cabinet at the Beaumont Police Department, Mary's DNA evidence waited. The killer's genetic signature, preserved on swabs and slides, patient as death itself. On television, shows about forensic science grew popular. Mrs. Edwards watched them religiously, learning terminology that made her feel closer to the investigation that continued in fits and starts whenever a new detective took interest or a similar case sparked comparison. By 2010, 15 years had passed since Mary's murder. The cemetery where she was buried had expanded, new sections added to accommodate a growing community. Her gravestone, once standing alone in a section reserved for young deaths, was now surrounded by others. Allison's hair had begun to show gray, though she was only 40. She visited the grave monthly, sometimes bringing flowers, sometimes just sitting in the car and talking to Mary about cases she was working on, families she was trying to help. The granite had weathered well, though winter freezes had created small cracks around the edges. Someone, probably their mother, had planted rose bushes nearby that bloomed pink each spring, Mary's favorite color. The technology keeps getting better, Allison said during one of these visits. They can solve cases now with tiny amounts of DNA, skin cells from doorknobs, saliva from envelope flaps. Mrs. Edwards still kept the scrapbooks, though the frequency of articles about Mary's case had dwindled to anniversary pieces that grew shorter each year. The case remained officially open, but active investigation had long since ceased. Detective Wallace had retired, his replacement showing polite interest but no new insights. The handcuffs remained in evidence storage, along with the DNA samples that had never matched anything in the database. I dream about you sometimes, Allison continued, her breath visible in the cold air. You're still 28, still teaching. You tell me not to worry, that everything happens in God's time. She paused, listening to birds in the oak tree that shaded Mary's grave. I hope that's true. I hope there's still time. The wind picked up, scattering dead leaves across the cemetery. Allison stood, leaving the fresh flowers she'd brought against the weathered stone. 2015 brought a brief flicker of renewed interest in Mary's case. A new detective, fresh from training in cold case investigation techniques, pulled the file and spent several weeks reviewing the evidence. Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to Mrs. Chen from the church, had been specifically hired to work cold cases using new technologies that hadn't existed in 1995. She was young, enthusiastic, and convinced that many unsolved murders could be cracked with fresh eyes and better science. The DNA evidence is still viable, she told the Edwards family during a meeting at the police station. We've kept it properly stored, and the samples are intact. Mrs. Edwards leaned forward in her chair, scrapbook vol. 7 balanced on her lap. What about those genetic databases I've been reading about? The ones that match family members? That technology is still developing, Chen admitted. Right now, we need a direct match to someone already in the system, but it's getting better every year. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Chen asked about Mary's high school years, her college friends, anyone from her past who might have harbored resentment. The same questions asked 20 years earlier, but with fresh determination. I'll be honest with you, Chen said as the meeting ended. This case is solvable. The evidence is there. It's just a matter of matching it to the right person. That night, Allison couldn't sleep. She walked to her kitchen window and looked out at the quiet street where she'd grown up, where Mary had visited weekly for family dinners. Somewhere out there, Mary's killer was probably sleeping peacefully, convinced he'd gotten away with murder. In the evidence room, a sealed bag containing DNA swabs sat in climate-controlled storage, waiting for science to catch up with justice. The year 2020 began like any other for the Edwards family, marked by the 14th of January memorial ritual they'd observed for 25 years. But by March, everything had changed, not just for them, but for the entire world. The COVID-19 pandemic had shuttered businesses, schools, and churches. Mrs. Edwards, now in her 70s, found herself isolated at home with her scrapbooks, watching the news and worrying about a world that seemed to be falling apart. It was during this strange, suspended time that Texas Ranger Jake Wilson received a grant to work cold cases using advanced genetic genealogy. Wilson was known throughout the state for his persistence, his willingness to spend weeks poring over files that other investigators had given up on. Mary Catherine Edwards's case landed on his desk on a Tuesday morning in September. He opened the first scrapbook Mrs. Edwards had donated to the police archives and began reading. The handwritten notes in the margins caught his attention. Mrs. Edwards had made connections, noticed patterns, asked questions that showed a mother's desperate attention to detail. Her observations were meticulous, her memory for facts sharp, even after 2.5 decades. This family never gave up, Wilson said to his partner. Look at this documentation. It's better than most police files. The DNA evidence intrigued him most. 25 years in storage, but still viable. The original investigators had done excellent work preserving the samples, perhaps intuiting that future technology would eventually solve what 1995 science could not. Wilson packaged the DNA samples carefully and addressed them to Othram Laboratory in Texas, a company specializing in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. The technology that could identify suspects through distant relatives was finally ready. On a cold October morning, he mailed the package that would finally bring Mary Catherine Edwards the justice her family had fought for across nearly 3 decades. The scientists at Othram Laboratory in the Woodlands, Texas, specialized in the impossible. They took DNA samples degraded by time, contaminated by environmental factors, or simply too small for traditional analysis, and coaxed genetic profiles from material other labs had given up on. Mary Catherine Edwards' case intrigued them from the moment the samples arrived. 25-year-old DNA, carefully preserved but limited in quantity, representing one of Texas's most persistent cold cases. Dr. Kristen Middleman, Othram's chief development officer, personally oversaw the process. Using advanced sequencing technology, her team built a genetic profile from the degraded samples, identifying hundreds of thousands of genetic markers that could be compared against genealogy databases. The profile went to genealogist Shara LaPointe, a specialist in forensic genetic genealogy who had helped solve dozens of cold cases. LaPointe worked like a detective through family trees, tracing genetic connections across generations. "I'm seeing connections to several families in East Texas," LaPointe reported after her initial analysis. "The genetic signature suggests someone with roots in the region going back multiple generations." She built family trees methodically, working backward from genetic cousins identified in public genealogy databases. The work was painstaking, requiring her to verify births, deaths, marriages, and migrations across generations of Texas families. After weeks of analysis, a name began to emerge: Clayton Bernard Foreman. Born in East Texas, graduated from Beaumont High School, married in 1984. LaPointe cross-referenced the family tree with public records and found an address in Ohio. "I need more verification," she told the Othram team. "But this individual fits the geographic and generational profile we're seeing in the DNA." Texas Ranger Wilson received the preliminary report on a Thursday evening in March 2021. He read it twice, then began his own investigation into Clayton Bernard Foreman. What he found would shock not just the Edwards family, but an entire community that thought it knew its secrets. The investigation into Clayton Bernard Foreman revealed connections that no one could have anticipated. Texas Ranger Wilson pulled records going back to Foreman's high school years in Beaumont, constructing a timeline that made his blood run cold. Foreman had graduated from Beaumont High School the same year as Mary Catherine Edwards. They'd known each other, had classes together, moved in the same social circles. But the connection went deeper than high school acquaintance. In 1984, Clayton Foreman had married his longtime girlfriend in a ceremony at Beaumont Baptist Church. The wedding photographs, preserved in the church archives, showed a young couple surrounded by friends and family. And there, standing beside the bride as bridesmaids, were Mary Catherine Edwards and her twin sister Allison. Wilson stared at the photograph for a long time. Mary, barely 22, smiled at the camera in a pink bridesmaid's dress. She had stood beside Clayton Foreman's new wife, celebrating what should have been a joyous occasion, never knowing that the groom would one day become her killer. Further investigation revealed a troubling pattern. Foreman's marriage had ended in 1987 amid accusations of domestic violence. His ex-wife had filed several police reports describing escalating abuse, including incidents involving restraints and handcuffs. "He had a thing about control," the ex-wife told Wilson during a phone interview. "He worked security for a while, had access to police equipment. The handcuffs weren't just for his job, he used them on me." She had moved to California after the divorce, changed her name, built a new life far from the man who had terrorized her. When Wilson showed her the wedding photograph from 1984, she immediately recognized Mary Edwards. "He talked about her sometimes," she said quietly. "Said she was the one who got away, that she was too good for guys like him. I thought it was just drunk talk." Wilson felt the pieces clicking into place. Foreman had known Mary since high school, had access to police restraints, and had demonstrated a pattern of violent behavior toward women. After his marriage collapsed in 1987, he'd remained in Beaumont for several more years before moving to Ohio in the early 1992. The timeline worked perfectly. Foreman would have known Mary's address, her habits, her schedule. As a former security guard with police connections, he could have accessed her townhouse without forced entry, convinced her to let him inside. Wilson began drafting the warrant request, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what he'd discovered. After 26 years, Mary Catherine Edwards' killer finally had a name and address. The 15th of April, 2021, Ohio. Clayton Bernard Foreman, now 58, lived in a modest suburban home outside Cleveland. His neighbors knew him as a quiet, helpful man who kept to himself but always waved hello. He worked maintenance at a local factory, paid his bills on time, and seemed utterly ordinary. Texas Ranger Wilson coordinated with Ohio law enforcement to establish surveillance. For 10 days, they watched Foreman's routines: work, grocery shopping, occasional visits to a local bar. Nothing in his behavior suggested he knew investigators were closing in. The DNA comparison required one final confirmation. Ohio detectives collected samples from Foreman's garbage, retrieving a discarded coffee cup and cigarette butts from his trash bin outside the factory where he worked. The samples went to the Texas Department of Public Safety lab for direct comparison against the DNA from Mary's crime scene. Wilson waited 3 agonizing days for results that would either confirm their suspect or send them back to square one. The call came on the 23rd of April at 3:17 p.m. "It's a match," the lab technician reported. 13 markers, no discrepancies. Clayton Bernard Foreman's DNA is consistent with the samples from your crime scene. Wilson closed his eyes and took a deep breath. 26 years, 4 months, and 9 days after Mary Catherine Edwards was found murdered in her bathtub, her killer had been identified with scientific certainty. The arrest warrant was signed that evening. Ohio authorities agreed to execute it at dawn on the 26th of April, coordinating with Texas officials who would handle extradition proceedings. Wilson called the Edwards family personally. When Allison Edwards answered the phone, he could barely contain his excitement. "We got him," he said simply. "We know who killed Mary." The 26th of April, 2021, 5:47 a.m. Clayton Bernard Foreman was stepping out of his shower when Ohio state troopers surrounded his house. He heard car doors slamming, saw flashlights through his bedroom window, and knew immediately that his carefully constructed life was over. The knock on his front door came firm and official. When he opened it, wearing only a bathrobe, 6 officers stood on his porch with weapons drawn. "Clayton Bernard Foreman, you're under arrest for the murder of Mary Catherine Edwards," the lead detective announced. "You have the right to remain silent." Foreman's face went through a sequence of emotions: surprise, confusion, then something that looked almost like relief. "Mary Edwards?" he said quietly. After all these years, the officers handcuffed him with standard-issue restraints, the same type he had used to bind Mary's wrists 26 years earlier. His neighbors emerged from their houses, watching in shock as the man they'd known as quiet and helpful was led away in the back of a police car. "I can't believe it," said Mrs. Patterson from next door. "He helped me carry groceries just last week. Seemed like such a nice man." The news reached Beaumont within hours. Texas Ranger Wilson called Allison Edwards at 8:30 a.m. with the confirmation she'd been waiting more than half her lifetime to hear. "He's in custody," Wilson told her. "Clayton Foreman is under arrest for Mary's murder." Allison dropped the phone, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The sound brought her mother running from the kitchen, and when Allison finally managed to speak, her words came out in gasps. "They got him, Mama. They finally got him." Mrs. Edwards sank into her chair, clutching volume 12 of Mary's scrapbooks. After 9,567 days, justice was finally within reach. The courthouse steps in Beaumont hadn't seen crowds like this since the oil boom trials of the 1942. Television trucks lined the street, reporters jostled for position, and curious citizens gathered behind police barriers to witness history. Clayton Foreman arrived at the Jefferson County Courthouse in shackles, transported from Ohio under heavy security. At 58, he looked older than his years, gray-haired and stooped, nothing like the confident young man who had smiled in those 1984 wedding photographs. The Edwards family sat in the front row of the public gallery, seeing Mary's killer in person for the first time. Allison gripped her mother's hand as Foreman was led past their seats, his wrists bound with the same type of Smith & Wesson handcuffs he had used on Mary. "That's him," Mrs. Edwards whispered, her voice barely audible. "That's the man who killed our Mary." The formal charges were read: capital murder, committed during the course of another felony. Foreman stood silently as the judge explained his rights, his lawyer entering a plea of not guilty on his behalf. District Attorney James Mitchell addressed the media afterward, outlining the evidence that had led to Foreman's arrest. The DNA match, the handcuff connection, the pattern of domestic violence, all pieces of a puzzle that had finally come together. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," Mitchell said. The Edwards family has waited 26 years for answers. Thanks to advances in genetic genealogy and the persistence of law enforcement, we can finally give them those answers. Allison spoke briefly to reporters, her voice steady despite her emotions. This is just the beginning of the end, she said. We've waited this long for justice. We can wait a little longer to see it served. The 15th of June, 2021, the Jefferson County Grand Jury returned a formal indictment against Clayton Bernard Foreman for the capital murder of Mary Catherine Edwards. The 23 citizens who heard evidence from Texas Ranger Wilson, DNA experts, and forensic pathologists deliberated for less than 2 hours. The evidence was overwhelming, said one grand juror who spoke anonymously after the proceedings. DNA doesn't lie. Foreman's defense team, led by veteran criminal attorney Marcus Webb, immediately began filing motions. They challenged the DNA evidence as degraded and potentially contaminated after 26 years in storage. They questioned the genetic genealogy methods used to identify their client. They argued that the case was too old, witnesses' memories too faded, to ensure a fair trial. The Edwards family prepared for a long legal battle. They had waited decades for this moment. They could endure whatever delays the defense might create. They're just doing their job, Allison told supporters who gathered at Beaumont Baptist Church for a prayer service. But we know the truth. Mary knows the truth, and now everyone else will know it too. Mrs. Edwards, now 76, began collecting materials for what would become the 13th and 14th volumes of Mary's scrapbooks. The arrest coverage, the legal filings, the expert testimonies, all documented with the same meticulous care she'd shown for 26 years. I always knew this day would come, she told a reporter from the Houston Chronicle. I just didn't know I'd live to see it. The trial was scheduled for March 2024, nearly 3 years away. Justice moved slowly, but the Edwards family had learned patience. They lit candles at Mary's grave that evening, the same ritual they'd performed for 26 years, but with hope. Instead of desperation for the first time since 1995, the months leading up to trial became a period of painful preparation. District Attorney Mitchell assembled a prosecution team that included specialists in cold case DNA evidence and experts in domestic violence patterns. They knew the defense would challenge every aspect of their case, particularly the genetic genealogy methods that had led to Foreman's identification. Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, a renowned forensic genealogist, spent weeks documenting the family tree analysis that had pointed to Foreman. Her work would need to be explained to jurors who might know nothing about DNA or genealogy, translated into language that ordinary citizens could understand and trust. The most difficult part of preparation involved interviewing Foreman's other victims. Texas Ranger Wilson had identified at least 6 women who reported being assaulted by Foreman over the years, their stories following disturbing patterns that mirrored Mary's murder. Sarah Mitchell, Foreman's ex-wife, agreed to testify despite her fear. She had built a new life in California, changed her name, thought she'd left her past behind forever. Now she would have to face her former husband in court and describe the violence he had inflicted. He had fantasies about control, she told prosecutor Janet Reynolds during a pretrial interview. He would talk about women who needed to be taught lessons, put in their place. When I saw Mary's picture in those wedding photos, I remembered how he used to stare at her during our reception. Another woman, Linda Chen, came forward after seeing news coverage of the arrest. She described an encounter with Foreman in 1987, 2 years before Mary's murder, in which he had attempted to assault her using handcuffs similar to those found at the crime scene. I never reported it, she admitted. I was embarrassed, scared. If I had spoken up then, maybe Mary would still be alive. The prosecution team assured her that Foreman alone bore responsibility for his crimes, but the weight of "what if" hung heavy in the preparation room. The 4th of March, 2024. The trial of Clayton Bernard Foreman began with jury selection that took 3 days. Potential jurors were questioned extensively about their understanding of DNA evidence, their ability to consider testimony about events from nearly 30 years ago, and their feelings about capital punishment. The courtroom gallery filled with supporters of the Edwards family, reporters from across Texas, and curious citizens who remembered Mary's murder from their own younger years. Mrs. Edwards, now 79 but sharp as ever, sat in the front row with her daughter Allison and a collection of family friends who had supported them through nearly 3 decades of waiting. Judge Rebecca Martinez called for order as the 12 jurors and 4 alternates took their seats. The same courtroom where oil barons and cattle rustlers had once faced justice would now hear the culmination of one of Texas's longest-running cold cases. Prosecutor Janet Reynolds stood to deliver the opening statement that would frame the next 2 weeks of testimony. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, 29 years ago, a young elementary school teacher named Mary Catherine Edwards was murdered in her own home by someone she trusted. For 29 years, her family has waited for justice. For 29 years, her killer walked free, believing he had committed the perfect crime. Reynolds outlined the evidence methodically: the DNA match that connected Foreman to the crime scene, his history of violence toward women, his access to police-grade handcuffs, and most damaging of all, his personal relationship with the victim. The defendant didn't kill a stranger, Reynolds continued. He killed someone who had stood beside his wife at their wedding, someone who had trusted him enough to let him into her home. The evidence will show that Clayton Foreman bound Mary Edwards with handcuffs, assaulted her, and left her to die in her bathtub while he walked away to build a new life in another state. Defense attorney Marcus Webb countered by challenging the reliability of 29-year-old evidence and questioning whether genetic genealogy methods met legal standards for identification. The prosecution wants you to convict my client based on degraded DNA and controversial family tree analysis, Webb argued. Science has advanced, but so has the potential for error. Mr. Foreman is innocent of these charges, and the evidence will show reasonable doubt. Judge Martinez banged her gavel. We will hear testimony beginning tomorrow morning. The prosecution's first witness was Mary's mother, now using a walker but determined to testify about the daughter she had found, murdered 29 years earlier. Mrs. Edwards spoke in a clear, steady voice as she described that terrible Saturday morning in January 1995. Mary was always reliable, she told the jury. When she didn't answer her phone, we knew something was wrong. We brought groceries and a pie I'd baked special for her. The courtroom fell silent as she described opening the door with their spare key, calling Mary's name, walking toward the bathroom where her nightmare had begun. No mother should ever see what I saw that day, Mrs. Edwards continued. My daughter, bound and lifeless in that bathtub, the sound that came out of me. I can still hear it sometimes at night. Allison Edwards followed her mother to the witness stand, describing her twin sister's life and their close relationship. She testified about Mary's kindness, her dedication to teaching, and the devastating impact her murder had on their family. Mary was the light of our family, Allison said, looking directly at Foreman for the first time. She had so much to give the world. Students who still write to us 30 years later, telling us how she changed their lives. He took all of that away. The most crucial testimony came from Dr. Jennifer Smith, the DNA expert who had overseen the comparison between Foreman's genetic profile and the evidence from Mary's crime scene. She explained the testing process in terms the jury could understand, walking them through each step that had led to the identification. The probability that this DNA belongs to anyone other than the defendant is approximately 1 in 7.2 billion, Dr. Smith testified. In other words, Clayton Foreman is the source of the DNA recovered from Mary Edwards' crime scene. Defense attorney Webb challenged her methodology during cross-examination, focusing on the age of the samples and the potential for contamination. Isn't it true that DNA degrades over time? He asked. Yes, but these samples were properly preserved using methods that maintain integrity for decades, Dr. Smith replied. But degradation could affect accuracy, couldn't it? The statistical analysis accounts for any degradation. The match is conclusive. The second week of trial brought testimony from Foreman's other victims, women who had waited decades to tell their stories. Sarah Mitchell, his ex-wife, took the stand wearing dark glasses and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. He became obsessed with control after our first year of marriage, she testified. At first it was just verbal, telling me how to dress, who I could talk to. Then it escalated to physical violence. Prosecutor Reynolds asked about the handcuffs found in their home during the divorce proceedings. He works security, said he needed them for work, Sarah replied, but he used them on me during intimate moments, not playfully. He would hurt me, ignore me when I said stop. She described finding wedding photos from 1984 after news of Foreman's arrest broke. When she saw Mary Edwards standing beside her as a bridesmaid, memories flooded back. Clayton talked about her sometimes when he'd been drinking, Sarah testified, said she was too good for guys like him, that she thought she was better than everyone else. I remember him staring at her during our reception, even on our wedding day. Linda Chen testified about her encounter with Foreman in 1987, describing how he had approached her at a Beaumont bar and later attempted to assault her in the parking lot. He had handcuffs with him, she said, her voice shaking. When I fought back, he called me names, said I was just like all the others who thought they were too good for him. The most emotional moment came when Mary's photograph was projected on the courtroom screen, her official school portrait, showing a young woman with bright eyes and a gentle smile. Several jurors wiped their eyes as they looked from the photograph to the defendant who had destroyed so much promise. Allison Edwards covered her face with her hands, still unable after all these years to see her sister's image without breaking down. The 20th of March, 2024, 2:47 p.m. The jury foreman stood in Jefferson County Court and delivered the words the Edwards family had been waiting nearly 3 decades to hear. We, the jury, find the defendant, Clayton Bernard Foreman, guilty of capital murder in the death of Mary Catherine Edwards. The courtroom exploded in gasps, tears, and scattered applause before Judge Martinez restored order. Mrs. Edwards collapsed into her daughter's arms, 29 years of grief and hope, converging in a single moment of vindication. Foreman showed no visible reaction to the verdict, sitting motionless as his attorney requested that the jury be polled individually. 12 voices, one by one, confirmed their unanimous decision, guilty, guilty, guilty. And the deliberation had taken 47 minutes, less time than Mary had been missing before her parents found her body. The jury foreman later told reporters that the DNA evidence left no room for doubt. "We looked at every piece of evidence carefully," he said, "but the science doesn't lie. Mr. Foreman's DNA was at that crime scene, and his history of violence toward women established a clear pattern." Outside the courthouse, District Attorney Mitchell addressed a crowd of reporters and supporters. "Justice has been served for Mary Catherine Edwards," he announced. "This case proves that no matter how much time passes, no matter how cold a case becomes, the truth has a way of surfacing. DNA doesn't forget, evidence doesn't lie, and families like the Edwards never give up." Allison Edwards spoke briefly to the media, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mary can rest now," she said. "We kept our promise to her. We never stopped fighting, and justice has finally come." The gavel fell with finality, sealing Clayton Foreman's fate and ending the longest chapter in Beaumont's criminal history. 1 week later, Judge Martinez returned to sentence Clayton Bernard Foreman. Texas law required a separate hearing for capital murder cases, giving both sides opportunity to present evidence about punishment. The prosecution called no additional witnesses, arguing that the brutality of Mary's murder and Foreman's pattern of violence spoke for themselves. The defense presented character witnesses who described Foreman as a helpful neighbor and reliable employee, painting a picture of a man who had lived quietly for decades. "My client has lived a law-abiding life for nearly 30 years, defense attorney Webb argued. "Whatever happened in 1995, he has shown himself capable of rehabilitation and positive contribution to society." Prosecutor Reynolds countered by reading victim impact statements from Mary's former students, now adults who credited their second-grade teacher with shaping their love of learning. "Mary Catherine Edwards touched hundreds of lives," Reynolds told the court. "Children who might have struggled in school found confidence in her classroom. The defendant didn't just kill one person, he killed all the future good she would have done." Judge Martinez deliberated for 30 minutes before returning with the sentence. "Clayton Bernard Foreman, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole until you reach the age of 93, she announced. "Furthermore, the court orders that you be restrained during transport using the same model Smith & Wesson handcuffs that were used to bind Mary Edwards." The symbolic gesture drew gasps from the gallery. As bailiffs approached Foreman with the handcuffs, Mrs. Edwards whispered to her daughter, "Mary's handcuffs are finally on the right person." That evening, CBS's 48 Hours aired a special episode about the case, broadcasting Mary's story to millions of viewers across the country. The Edwards family watched from their living room, seeing their decades of perseverance validated on national television. Spring 2025. The Texas wind moved gently through the cemetery where Mary Catherine Edwards had rested for 30 years. The pink granite headstone had weathered well, and the rosebushes planted by her mother bloomed faithfully each April. Allison Edwards knelt beside the grave, placing fresh daffodils against the stone. She was 53 now, her hair completely gray, but her voice was strong as she spoke to her twin sister. "We kept our promise, Mary," she whispered. "It took 30 years, but we kept it." Clayton Foreman will spend the rest of his life in prison. He'll never hurt another woman. The cemetery was quiet, except for birds singing in the oak trees and the distant sound of traffic from Highway 69. Beaumont had grown over the decades, new subdivisions spreading east toward the pine forests, but this old section of the cemetery remained unchanged. "Mama's doing well," Allison continued. "She's 80 now, still sharp as ever. She finished the 14th scrapbook last month, all the trial coverage, the verdict, the sentencing. She says it's the last one she'll need to make." A butterfly landed on the headstone, its wings the same pink as the roses that bloomed nearby. Allison watched it rest there for a moment before flying away toward the afternoon Sunday. "I think about what your life would have been like," she said. "You'd probably be retired from teaching by now, maybe have grandchildren to spoil. You always wanted a big family." She stood slowly, her knees aching from kneeling on the hard ground. The flowers looked perfect against the granite, a splash of yellow against gray stone. "I'll keep coming to visit," she promised, "but I won't come as often. You don't need me to fight for you anymore. You can rest now." Allison walked back toward her car, carrying peace mixed with sorrow, leaving Mary Catherine Edwards in the sunlight that would shine on her grave forever.